Victoria Hale snatched the shawl from Naomi's shoulders in front of 400 people and threw it on the floor like it was garbage. "Women like you," she said, loud enough for the whole room to hear, "don't belong at this table. You never did." No one moved. No one spoke. 400 powerful, wealthy, dangerous people, and every single one of them stood there and let it happen. Naomi didn't cry. She didn't run. She just stood there in her ruined dress, champagne soaking through the fabric, and thought about the 17 soldiers' families she'd quietly paid rent for that month. Families no one in this room even knew existed. She thought, is this really what I've been protecting? If that were you, standing in that room, humiliated in front of everyone, after everything you had quietly sacrificed, what would you do? If this story is already getting under your skin, hit that subscribe button right now, because this is the kind of story we tell here. Raw, real, and deeply human. Hit the like button, drop your city and country in the comments. I want to see how far Naomi's story travels. And don't you dare leave before the end. You're going to want to see what happens next. The invitation had arrived 6 weeks ago, printed on cream cardstock with the Ashford family seal embossed in gold, 2 crossed swords behind a hawk in mid-flight. Naomi had held it for a long time, standing alone in the kitchen of the Ashford estate, running her thumb over the raised ink. She hadn't wanted to go. That wasn't a secret she kept from anyone in particular. It was just a truth she carried quietly, the way she carried most things, folded up small, tucked somewhere behind her ribs where it wouldn't inconvenience anybody. "You don't have to," Damien had told her, 2 nights before his flight. He'd been packing, moving through the bedroom with that particular kind of efficiency he had, the focused silence of a man who never wasted motion. He'd paused at the closet, one hand on a suit bag, and looked at her directly. "Say the word, Naomi. I'll have Marcus send your regrets." "I'll go," she said. "You sure?" "I said I'll go, Damien." He'd studied her face for a moment longer than was comfortable. Damien Ashford had built an empire on reading people, knowing when they meant what they said and when they were performing it. With most people, he was never wrong. With Naomi, he always hesitated. "These people aren't, I know what they are." She turned back to the window. "I've been attending these galas for 4 years. I know exactly what they are." He hadn't pushed further. That was one of the quiet failures between them. Not cruelty, not coldness, just a pattern of not pushing through the thing that needed to be said. He left for the airport at 4 in the morning. She was already awake when he kissed her forehead, but she kept her eyes closed. She wasn't ready for another conversation that would end in the same careful silence. The car came for her at 6:30 the evening of the gala. She spent 2 hours getting dressed, which she would never admit to anyone. Not because she was vain. Naomi Carter had spent enough of her life being told what she looked like that vanity had long since lost its grip on her, but because she understood the game. She understood that she would walk into that ballroom and be measured against a standard she had never been asked to participate in designing. She would be too dark, too full-figured, too quiet, too present. She would be the wrong shape in the wrong frame. So she chose the emerald gown. Not because it would make her invisible, nothing would do that, but because it was the color of something alive, and she intended to walk into that room alive, even if no one else in it wanted her there. She sat in the car with her hands folded in her lap and watched the estate come into view through the tinted window. The long driveway lined with lanterns, the ivy climbing the stone facade, the valets already moving in coordinated arcs between the vehicles of the arriving guests. From the outside, it looked like something out of a magazine. It always did. She stepped out of the car alone. That was the first thing people noticed. No husband, no escort. Just Naomi Ashford standing at the base of the stone steps, adjusting the gold cuff on her wrist with the focused calm of a woman who had learned that the only way to enter a room like this was like you'd already decided to own it. She had not decided to own it, but she'd learned to look like she had. Inside, the ballroom had already reached its particular pitch of elegant performance. Crystal chandeliers threw warm light across a room full of people who spent a great deal of money looking like they didn't have to try. Naomi recognized most of them. The Callahan brothers from Chicago, both of whom had the exact same laugh. Evelyn Marsh, who controlled the Eastern port operations and wore the same pearl earrings to every event without exception. The Fontaine family from New Orleans, always clustered together like a closed fist. She moved through the room slowly, accepting a glass of sparkling water from a passing tray, nodding to the few people who acknowledged her. Some did. Mostly the ones who worked for the syndicate directly. Men and women who knew her not as Damien Ashford's wife, but as the woman who had quietly arranged for their children's tuition to disappear from their bills, or who had shown up unannounced at a hospital with paperwork that meant a family didn't have to choose between surgery and rent. They knew her in the way that people know someone who has helped them when help wasn't required. The others, the power brokers, the social climbers, the inheritors, those people looked through her, or they looked at her in that particular way that was designed to make a person feel like an error. She was used to it. That was the problem, she supposed. She had become so used to it. The first crack appeared within 40 minutes of her arrival. She was standing near the tall windows at the far end of the ballroom, half listening to a conversation she hadn't been invited into, when she became aware of laughter behind her. Specifically, the kind of laughter that is meant to be heard by its target. Sharp, carried on purpose. She turned just enough to see them. 3 women, mid-50s, draped in the kind of wealth that announces itself through understatement. She knew 2 of them by name. The third she recognized from photographs, Celeste Fontaine, who ran the Southern gambling operations through a series of restaurants and had never once, in 4 years, spoken directly to Naomi. She heard her own name. She heard the word wife said the way you might say mistake. She turned back to the window. This was the calculus she had made long ago, and she made it again now, quickly and quietly. If she reacted, it became a scene. If it became a scene, it became a story. If it became a story, it damaged Damien's relationships with the Fontaine operation, which was already strained, and she would be the cause of that damage. She would become the liability they already assumed she was. So she stood at the window and let it pass. The second crack came from a direction she hadn't anticipated. One of the senior stewards, a man named Gerald, who had worked the Ashford estate for over a decade, appeared at her elbow with an expression she couldn't immediately read. "Mrs. Ashford," he said quietly, "I've been asked to let you know. Mr. Harlan has requested that you assist with the welcome service at the east entrance." She looked at him. "I'm sorry?" Gerald didn't meet her eyes. "Mr. Harlan Ashford," he said. He wanted the family present at the entry point. "The entry point?" She repeated the words carefully. "For the welcome service." "Yes, ma'am." Harlan Ashford was Damien's uncle, 72 years old, and had spent 40 of those years being furious about things he couldn't control. He had opposed the marriage from the beginning, not subtly, not quietly, but in the way powerful men of a certain generation oppose things they found inconvenient, which was loudly and without apology. She understood what was being asked. She was being asked to stand at a door and hand people programs. She thought about it for exactly 3 seconds. "Tell Mr. Harlan," she said, "that I'll be happy to greet guests from the main floor. I'll stay visible." Gerald hesitated, then nodded and withdrew. She had given him an answer that was technically cooperative and practically meaningless. She wasn't going to stand at a door. She wasn't going to be positioned like staff. But she also wasn't going to make Gerald the messenger in a war she didn't want to start tonight. The third crack, and this one left a mark. She had moved toward the eastern wing of the ballroom near the string quartet when she heard the voice she'd been half bracing for all evening. Victoria Hale's voice had a particular quality to it, honey over gravel, every word shaped like it had been practiced for maximum impact. She was 41, tall in the way that women are sometimes described as striking when what people actually mean is frightening, and she had wanted to be the Ashford family's first lady for approximately as long as Damien had existed in her social orbit. The marriage to Naomi had not gone over well with Victoria. "I was just saying," Victoria announced to the cluster of people around her, loud enough again to be heard, "that I think it speaks volumes about a man's judgment when he lets sentiment cloud strategy." No one asked her to elaborate. She elaborated anyway. "Damien is brilliant. No one disputes that. But brilliance and wisdom aren't the same thing." She picked up a glass of champagne with the ease of someone performing casualness. "A man who leads an empire needs a partner who can hold the room, who commands presence, who understands." She paused, just long enough. "The weight of the name she carries." The implication hung in the air like smoke. Naomi was 6 feet away. She knew Victoria knew that. She kept her face still and thought about 17 rent checks and a boy named Marcus Jr., who was at Columbia on a scholarship no one in this room knew she'd arranged, and the widow of a man named Thomas Reyes, who had died in service to the syndicate 4 years ago and who now had a house in Phoenix paid off in full. She thought, I know what I'm worth. The thought didn't make Victoria's voice stop, but it gave her somewhere to stand. What came next happened fast, the way things do when cruelty finds its confidence. Victoria set her champagne glass on the edge of a nearby tray. Except she didn't quite set it, she tilted it, and the glass tipped, and a full pour of champagne cascaded across the front of Naomi's emerald gown with a sound that seemed, in that moment, incredibly loud. The room didn't go silent, but the people in the immediate vicinity did, which was somehow worse. It made it a smaller, more intimate thing. Witnessed, marked, savored. Oh, Victoria said. Her voice was perfectly calibrated. Concern without care. How clumsy of me.
I'm so sorry. She didn't sound sorry. She sounded satisfied. Naomi stood very still and looked down at her dress. The champagne was cold and spreading, and her first thought, which she would be ashamed of later, was that she was relieved she'd worn dark enough fabric that the stain might not show too badly in the photographs she knew someone was already taking. Her second thought was, don't cry. Do not cry here. No harm done, she said. Her voice came out steady. She was proud of that, even though the pride felt thin and miserable. We should get someone to clean that up, Victoria said, and gestured to a nearby server. Not to help Naomi, but toward the floor, where a small spill had landed. Be careful, she added to the server, as though the accident were Naomi's fault and the server needed the warning. Someone in the cluster laughed, not at anything that had been said, just at the situation, at the permission the laughter granted. Naomi excused herself and walked to the nearest restroom with her spine straight and her jaw tight and her hands. Her hands were shaking, which she hadn't expected and couldn't stop, and she pressed them flat against the marble counter and looked at herself in the mirror until they steadied. The woman in the mirror looked tired, not defeated. There was a difference, and she'd spent enough years learning that difference that she could see it clearly now. Tired, yes. Worn down in the particular way that comes not from one big catastrophe, but from 100 small ones, each one carefully chosen to land just below the threshold where a person can point to it and say, that right there, that is what broke me. She washed her hands. She blotted what she could from the fabric. She straightened her cuffs. She went back out, because that was what you did. That was what she had always done. Not because she was a saint. She was not a saint. She had a temper she'd spent years learning to manage, and a stubbornness that Damien called her greatest flaw, with equal parts admiration and frustration. But because she understood that the night was not over, and the room was full of people who needed to see her walk back in. Not for them. For the ones watching who were also tired. For Gerald, who had delivered an insulting message and looked ashamed of it. For the server who had been gestured at like furniture. For every person in that room who wasn't quite powerful enough to fight back and was watching to see what she would do. She walked back in, and Victoria was waiting. I was just telling Harlan, Victoria said, appearing at Naomi's side with a fluency that suggested she'd been positioned there on purpose, that perhaps this year's gala would be better served with fewer distractions. I appreciate your concern for the event, Naomi said. It's not the event I'm concerned about. Victoria's voice dropped just slightly, low enough to be almost private, which made it more dangerous. It's the legacy. The Ashford name has meant something for 3 generations. I'd hate to see that meaning diluted. Naomi looked at her. She really looked at her. At the sharp architecture of Victoria's ambition, the way it had hollowed out something underneath that must have been a person once. At the particular exhaustion of being someone who wanted something so badly that they'd turned cruelty into a strategy. The Ashford name, Naomi said very quietly, is fine. Victoria studied her for a moment. Then she smiled. A real smile, which was somehow worse than the performance. For now, she said, and walked away. Naomi stood alone at the edge of the ballroom, champagne drying in the fabric of her dress, the sound of a string quartet, drifting over the heads of 400 people who had been watching without watching, and she made herself breathe. She had made a promise to herself years ago, in a different room in a different life, that she would never let anyone see her break. Not because strength was about suppression, she knew better than that now, but because she had learned, the hard way and the slow way, that some rooms don't deserve your breaking. Some rooms don't earn the truth of you. This was one of those rooms. She looked up at the ceiling,
The high vaulted ceiling of the Ashford ballroom with its painted plasterwork and its imported chandeliers. And for just a moment, she let herself feel the full, crushing weight of everything she had swallowed in 4 years of being in rooms like this one. Then she exhaled. She found an empty chair near the windows, sat down with her water glass, and waited for the night to be over. She didn't know yet that the night was only beginning. She didn't know that somewhere above her, in the narrow service corridor that ran along the upper gallery of the ballroom, a door had opened quietly, and a man in a dark suit had stopped walking and was standing very still and had been watching for the last 11 minutes. She didn't know that the things she'd been protecting, the peace she'd maintained, the conflicts she'd swallowed, the silence she'd kept, was about to become the most visible thing in the room. She thought the night was almost done with her. She was wrong. She had been sitting by the window for maybe 8 minutes when Gerald came back. He moved the way men move when they're delivering something they wish someone else had been asked to deliver. Shoulders slightly forward, gaze slightly down. The whole body language of a man trying to shrink an errand. He stopped beside her chair and leaned in just enough to be private about it. "Mrs. Ashford," he paused. "Mr. Harlan would like a word." She looked up at him. "Where?" "The East Salon. He asked that you come. Now, if possible." The words "if possible" were doing a lot of work in that sentence. Naomi had known Gerald long enough to understand what he was actually saying, which was, he didn't say "if possible." I added that part because I felt bad about this errand. "Thank you, Gerald," she said, and stood. The East Salon was a smaller room off the main corridor, a place where the Ashford men had historically conducted conversations they didn't want witnessed. It smelled like old leather, and something that might have been pipe tobacco from 3 decades ago, a smell so embedded in the walls it had stopped being a smell and started being an atmosphere. Harlan Ashford was standing at the window when she entered. He didn't turn around immediately, which she recognized as a power move so old it had gone past strategy and into instinct. He was a large man who had been larger once, and the particular posture of men who used to be physically imposing but aren't anymore, the stiff spine, the deliberate stillness, was something Naomi had learned to read early. She sat down without being invited to. That made him turn. "I didn't say sit," he said. "You didn't say stand either," she said. "Harlan, it's been a long evening. What do you need?" He studied her for a moment with those pale eyes that Damien had inherited but used so differently. Harlan's eyes calculated. Damien's watched. There was a distinction. "I'm going to say this plainly," Harlan said, "because I think you're a plain woman, and plain women understand plain language better than they understand delicacy." She didn't respond to the packaging. She waited for the content. "This family," he said, "has operated for 61 years on the principle that reputation is architecture. You don't build it fast, and you don't recover it fast when it falls. Everything we are, everything Damien has built on top of what I built, on top of what my father built, exists because people in this world believe in the weight of our name." He moved away from the window. "You understand what I'm saying to you?" "I understand the words," she said. "I'm waiting to hear what they have to do with me." His jaw tightened. "You are what they have to do with you." The room sat with that for a moment. 4 years, he continued. 4 years Damien has brought you into rooms like this one, and I have watched. I have watched the way people look, the way they talk afterward, the questions they ask Naomi about whether Damien's judgment is what it used to be. Who's asking those questions? People. Name one. That's not. Name one person, she said, who has told you directly that Damien's standing has been damaged by his marriage. Harlan's mouth opened and then closed. She watched him recalibrate. "It's not always about what's said directly," he said. "No," she agreed. "Sometimes it's about what people like Victoria Hale say in ballrooms when they think the boss's wife is too far away to hear them." Something moved through his expression. She couldn't quite name it. It wasn't guilt. She doubted Harlan was capable of guilt in the traditional architecture of the emotion, but it was something adjacent, a recognition, maybe, of what was actually happening tonight and who had set it in motion. Victoria is running a campaign," Naomi said. The word came out flat and certain. "She has been running it since the week after our wedding. You know that, Harlan. I know that. The only question I have is whether you invited me in here because you want me to help you address it, or because she asked you to." The silence that followed was its own kind of answer. It lasted 4 seconds. She counted. You should consider, Harlan said slowly, whether your continued presence in this family's public life is... Don't. Her voice didn't rise. It compressed. There was a difference, and the difference mattered. Do not finish that sentence. Naomi, I have been in this family for 4 years. I have attended every event, managed every conflict I was capable of managing quietly, and supported every decision Damien made even when I disagreed with it. I have never, not once, embarrassed this family publicly. She stood up. Tonight is not the night I start. But I'm also not going to stand in this room and listen to you suggest that I should make myself smaller to accommodate Victoria Hale's ambitions. So if that's what this conversation is, it's over. She moved toward the door. Your husband, Harlan said to her back, is not here. She stopped. The statement was so simple and so deliberate and so precisely aimed that for a moment she simply stood with her hand near the door and felt the full weight of it. Your husband is not here. Translation, your protection is not here. Your authority is borrowed. What you think you are in this room, you are only because of a man who is currently on another continent, and in his absence, you are what we say you are. She had known this. She had always known this. The knowing didn't make the hearing of it easier. She turned around. I know he's not here, she said. That's why I came. She opened the door and walked out, and she did not look back, and her hands were not shaking this time, and she was not sure if that was strength or if she had simply run out of the physiological capacity for it. Back in the main corridor, she stood still for a moment and breathed. The party sounds reached her, the music, the laughter, the particular white noise of 400 expensive people enjoying themselves. She pressed 2 fingers against the inside of her wrist, a habit she'd had since she was a child. Something about the pulse there that reminded her of being solid, being physical, being a person with a body that was hers, regardless of what anyone in any room thought about it. Steady, steady, she went back in. The next 40 minutes were a different kind of warfare, the kind that happens in increments, in gestures so small they could each be dismissed as misunderstanding or accident, but which accumulate into something unmistakable. Someone moved her place card from the host-adjacent table to a table near the service entrance. When she found her new seat and sat down without comment, the woman beside her, a Callahan sister-in-law, whose name Naomi could never remember, leaned almost imperceptibly away, as though proximity itself was a statement she didn't want to make. The man across from her talked around her for 20 minutes, addressing every comment to the person on her left, performing Naomi's absence with such commitment that she wondered if he'd practiced it. She ate the first course. She drank water. She answered the 2 questions she was asked with the brevity that the questioners clearly wanted, because what they wanted wasn't an answer, it was confirmation that she knew her place in this particular choreography. She knew her place, she just didn't accept it. The moment that changed the room's temperature came from a direction she hadn't anticipated, which was the only direction things ever really came from. A young woman, early 30s, dark-haired, wearing a dress that hadn't cost as much as everyone else's at this table, and who therefore Naomi immediately trusted slightly more than average, leaned across the table during a lull in the performance of conversation. You're Naomi Ashford, she said. I am. I'm Clara Reyes. She said the last name with a particular emphasis, watching Naomi's face. Thomas Reyes was my father. The table didn't go quiet, because no one else at the table was paying enough attention to register what had just been said. But something between the 2 women went very still. Thomas Reyes, who had died 4 years ago, 3 weeks before Naomi's wedding, who had been loyal to Damien for 11 years, whose widow had a paid-off house in Phoenix, whose daughter was sitting at this table and saying her name with that look on her face. Not quite gratitude, not quite accusation, something in between. I know who your father was, Naomi said quietly. My mother told me, Clara said. She told me last year. She didn't know before that. She paused. She wanted me to say thank you if I ever met you. I wasn't sure I would. I didn't know. She glanced around the table, then back at Naomi. I didn't know what you'd be like. What did you think I'd be like? Clara considered this honestly, which Naomi appreciated. Harder, she said. I thought you'd be harder. The night's not over, Naomi said. Clara almost smiled. Almost. It was the closest thing to a genuine human moment Naomi had had all evening, and it lasted approximately 90 seconds before Victoria Hale materialized at the edge of the table like a weather event. "Clara," Victoria said warmly, directing all of her considerable attention at the young woman as though Naomi weren't sitting 3 feet away. "I didn't know you were attending this year. Your father would have been so proud to see you here." She placed a hand briefly on Clara's shoulder, a gesture so perfectly calibrated in its false intimacy that Naomi had to admire the technique even while hating it. "The Reyes family has always been so important to us." Clara looked at the hand on her shoulder. Then she looked at Victoria's face. "Yes," she said. "Absolutely." There was something in her voice that was exactly as warm as the thing Victoria had offered her, which is to say, not warm at all, but performing warmth flawlessly. Naomi filed this away. Clara Reyes was interesting. Victoria turned finally to Naomi, as though she'd only just noticed her. "Naomi." The smile she used was the second one, but the real one, the one that wasn't a performance but a weapon. "You found a seat." "I did." "How resourceful." She pulled out the empty chair beside Naomi and sat down in it with the unhurried ease of a woman claiming territory. "I actually wanted to check on you after earlier, with the champagne." Her voice was all soft concern. "I felt just terrible about that." "You mentioned. Did the stain come out?" "I didn't try to get it out." Victoria glanced at the fabric. "Well, it's not too obvious." "A beat. If you don't look too closely." The man across the table laughed, actually laughed, at this, and then appeared to remember he was a grown adult and converted it into a cough, which fooled no one. "Victoria," Naomi said, keeping her voice at a completely normal register, "what do you want from me tonight?" The directness landed like a dropped glass. Victoria blinked, the first unguarded reaction Naomi had gotten from her all evening. "I just wanted to—" "What do you want?" Naomi said again. "Not what you're pretending to want. What do you actually want from tonight?" Victoria recovered within about 2 seconds, which was genuinely impressive. The weapon smile came back up. "I want what's best for this family," she said. "I always have." "And you've decided that what's best for this family is to spend this evening making sure everyone in that ballroom watches you humiliate Damien's wife." "That's a very dramatic, 'you moved my place' card," Naomi said. Silence. "I don't know what Gerald moves the cards. He's been doing it since 2018. He does exactly what the family leadership tells him to do." She looked at Victoria steadily. "Your family leadership. Harlan does what you ask him to do, which I didn't fully appreciate until tonight, but now I do. And you asked him to call me into the East Salon so you could run your operation in the ballroom without me watching." Something in Victoria's face, not guilt, not that, but something close to respect, which was more unsettling, shifted. "You're smarter than people think," Victoria said. "I know," Naomi said. "That's always been the problem." Victoria stood. She smoothed the front of her dress. She looked down at Naomi with an expression that had stopped pretending to be anything other than what it was. "This isn't personal," she said. "Of course it is," Naomi said. "Everything that matters is." Victoria walked away. Clara, across the table, was looking at Naomi with something that had shifted considerably since the conversation began. She picked up her water glass and said nothing for a moment. Then, "Are you going to be okay tonight?" "I'm always okay," Naomi said. "That's not what I asked." Naomi looked at her. Clara Reyes was Thomas's daughter. Thomas, who had been loyal past the point where loyalty was easy, who had made a choice that cost him everything, who had served an organization that had not always deserved the serving. Clara had her father's eyes. Direct. Patient. Waiting for the real answer. "I don't know," Naomi said, which was the most honest thing she'd said all evening. The dinner service began, and the room settled into a different rhythm. The clatter of courses, the refilling of glasses, the performance of relaxation among people who were never quite relaxed. Naomi ate without tasting much. She watched the room the way she'd learned to watch rooms. Not with anxiety, but with the particular attention of someone who has learned that the things that matter most announce themselves quietly, in peripheral vision, in the gap between what people say and what their hands are doing. Victoria had moved to the far end of the room, near the bar. She was talking to Harlan and to 2 men Naomi recognized as members of the family council, old money and older grudges, both of them. She was talking with her hands, which she didn't usually do, which meant the conversation was substantive and she was selling something. Naomi watched this for 4 minutes without appearing to watch it. At the end of the 4 minutes, all 4 of them looked across the room at her. She looked back. She didn't look away. Harlan looked away first, which told her something. Then one of the council members. Victoria looked away last, and when she did, it was with the expression of a woman who had made a decision and was at peace with it. That expression worried Naomi more than any of the words had. The third course had barely been cleared when it started. It started with Harlan's voice from the center of the room, louder than necessary, which was also the point. "I'd like to propose something," he said, and the room's noise dropped because Harlan Ashford's voice carried 61 years of authority, and people in this world still responded to that, even when they didn't like him. In the spirit of the evening, in the spirit of what this gala represents, he raised his glass. Service. Nods. The room liked service as a concept. The Ashford organization was built by people who understood that no one is above the work, that real leadership means rolling up your sleeves, that the title doesn't protect you from the task. He turned, and his gaze landed on Naomi with a weight that was entirely intentional. "I think it would be meaningful, symbolic even, if we demonstrated that tonight." She understood what was coming approximately 3 seconds before it arrived. "Naomi," Harlan said, "would you help our service team with the next course? Show our guests what real Ashford values look like." The room was quiet. 400 people, and the quiet was absolute. She felt it the way you feel pressure change before a storm. In the ears, in the chest, in the specific way the air gets heavy with the weight of something that hasn't happened yet but is going to. She sat very still. She thought about what she'd told herself in the bathroom. Some rooms don't deserve your breaking. She thought about what Clara Reyes had asked her. "Are you going to be okay?" She thought about Damien, on a plane somewhere over the Atlantic, or already landed somewhere, handling business she didn't fully know the shape of, trusting her. She realized now he had trusted her, even if neither of them had said it in those exact words, to hold the room in his absence. She stood up. She walked across the ballroom floor toward the service station with her spine straight and the full attention of 400 people on her back and her face completely, deliberately, exhaustingly still. She picked up a serving tray. And in the gallery above, behind the narrow window that ran along the upper observation corridor, a set of dark eyes watched her do it, and the man those eyes belonged to went very, very still. Stiller than he had been for the previous 11 minutes of watching. Stiller than he had been since the car had dropped him at the estate's private entrance 40 minutes ago. Stiller than anyone who had ever seen Damien Ashford handle a crisis had ever seen him be. Because she picked up the tray. Not because she agreed, not because she accepted it, but because she was protecting something she loved even while it failed to protect her. And he could see that. He could see the entire shape of it now, spread out below him like a map of something he should have understood years earlier and hadn't. His right hand, at his side, closed into a fist. He didn't move yet, but the stillness had changed character entirely. It was no longer the stillness of a man watching and processing. It was the stillness of a man who had finished processing and was now deciding how this would end, and the deciding was already done. And what came next was simply the execution of a thing that could not be walked back. Naomi moved through the room with the tray in her hands, and someone laughed, a genuine laugh, delighted by the spectacle of it. And Victoria Hale stood at the edge of the room with her arms at her sides and her weapon smile at full power, watching the woman she'd spent 4 years dismantling finally, visibly, appear to be exactly what Victoria had always told this room she was. She appeared to have won. She had not won. She had, in the space of the last 40 minutes, made the single most consequential mistake of her life, and the proof of that was standing 60 feet above her in a service corridor, watching with eyes that were no longer processing. She carried the tray for 6 minutes. 6 minutes is not a long time in most contexts. 6 minutes is the length of a song, or a short phone call, or the time it takes to drink a cup of coffee while it's still hot. In a ballroom full of 400 people who were watching a woman they'd spent all evening trying to break finally appear to be broken, 6 minutes was an eternity. Naomi moved between tables with the tray held level, offering the small plates of the third course to people who took them without looking at her, or who looked at her with the particular expression of people who are enjoying something they know they shouldn't enjoy, which is the most honest expression cruelty ever wears. She kept her face neutral. She kept her breathing even. She focused on the physical mechanics of the task, the weight of the tray, the placement of her feet on the marble floor, the small adjustments of balance that kept everything steady, because the physical mechanics were something she could control, and control was the only territory she had left right now. A woman at the fourth table she reached, older, silver-haired, wearing a brooch that Naomi recognized as a piece she'd seen in a museum catalog once, held out her hand for a plate and then paused with the plate halfway between them and said, not quietly, "Damien really ought to have hired someone with more presence for this role." The table laughed. Naomi placed the plate in the woman's hand and moved on. At the sixth table, someone touched her arm. She stopped. It was a man she didn't know well, mid-50s, one of the peripheral Ashford business connections, someone whose name she could recall if she tried and didn't want to try right now. And he leaned in with the confidential air of a person delivering what they believe is a kindness. "You don't have to do this, you know," he said quietly. She looked at him. "I mean," he said, and she could see him losing confidence in the sentence the moment it left his mouth. "Harlan's just... it's theater. It doesn't mean... Which plate would you like?" she said. He took one. He looked away. She moved on. By the time she returned the empty tray to the service station, something had shifted in the room. She could feel it without being able to name it precisely. The laughter had a different quality, more restless, as though the spectacle had delivered less satisfaction than expected and people were recalibrating toward the next thing. She understood, in the way she understood most things about rooms like this one, that the next thing was already being prepared. She found her seat. Clara Reyes looked at her across the table with an expression so carefully blank it communicated everything. "Don't," Naomi said quietly. "I wasn't going to say anything." "Good." Clara turned her water glass in a slow circle on the tablecloth. "My father used to say that the worst rooms are the ones where the cruelty is so normalized that the people inflicting it have stopped noticing they're doing it. Your father was right. He also said that's when it's most dangerous, when nobody's paying attention to themselves." She paused. "Somebody in this room is paying very close attention." Naomi followed her gaze without meaning to. Victoria was at the bar again. But she wasn't talking to Harlan now. She was talking to a man Naomi recognized with a specific cold sensation that started at the base of her spine and moved upward. Marcus Webb, who ran the syndicate's financial operations, and who had been, as far as Naomi knew, completely loyal to Damien for 9 years. They were not having the kind of conversation you have at a bar at a gala. Their heads were angled toward each other with the particular geometry of people exchanging information they don't want the room to have. Victoria's hand was on Webb's forearm, not flirtatiously, not warmly, but in the way you hold something you need to stay in place. Webb nodded twice. Then he took out his phone. Naomi watched him type something. She thought, what is she doing? She thought, who is he texting? She thought, this is not about tonight anymore. The realization arrived with the flat, declarative certainty of things you've been almost knowing for a while and then suddenly know all the way. Whatever Victoria had been building tonight, the humiliation, the maneuvering, the careful engineering of Naomi's public diminishment, it wasn't the operation. It was the cover for the operation. While everyone, including Naomi, had been watching the theater of the evening, something else had been happening underneath it. She needed to think. She needed 60 seconds alone to think, and she was in a room with 400 people, and the thinking had to happen now. She stood up, excused herself to no one in particular, and walked toward the corridor that led to the private library on the east wing. Not the salon where Harlan had received her, but the smaller room beyond it, the one with the bookshelves and the telephone that still worked on a landline, because Damien's father had believed that anything that could be jammed or intercepted was a liability. She closed the door behind her. The silence was immediate and enormous. She stood in the middle of the room with her hands at her sides and made herself think clearly. Victoria had spent 4 years as the heir apparent to a position that no longer existed once Damien married Naomi. That was a loss that would calcify a person. That was a loss with enough weight to turn patience into strategy and strategy into something more serious. Naomi had understood this. What she had not fully understood, what tonight had shown her with the particular efficiency of things made visible too late, was that Victoria's ambition had not stayed still during those 4 years. It had moved, it had made alliances, It had built something. Marcus Webb had 9 years of institutional knowledge about the syndicate's financial architecture. He knew where the money moved, how it was protected, what the vulnerabilities were. If Victoria had spent 4 years cultivating that access. The door opened. Naomi turned. It was not who she expected. It was not Gerald or Clara or even one of Harlan's emissaries. It was Marcus Webb. He stepped into the room and closed the door behind him and looked at her with an expression that was not quite apology and not quite threat, which made it the most frightening kind of expression available. "Mrs. Ashford," he said. "Marcus." She kept her voice even. "This is an interesting place for a conversation. I needed to speak with you privately." "About." He reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and produced a folded document. 3 pages, she could see, dense with numbers. He held it out to her and she took it because not taking it would have told him something she didn't want to tell him yet. She unfolded it and looked at the first page and felt the blood leave her face. It was a transfer authorization, dated 6 weeks ago. Moving $47 million from the Ashford Legacy Trust, the fund Naomi had spent 3 years building, the fund that paid for the families, the scholarship accounts, the medical expenses, the widow's mortgages, into a series of shell accounts she had never seen before and did not recognize, authorized under her signature. Her signature. She read it 3 times. Not because she was slow, but because her brain was performing the particular function of refusing to process something that couldn't be true, and then processing it anyway, and then going back to refuse again. And, "That's not my signature," she said. "I know," Webb said. She looked up at him. "It's a very good forgery," he said. "Good enough to pass a cursory review, not good enough to survive a forensic examination." He paused. "Victoria had it done 6 weeks ago. I became aware of it 4 days ago." The room was very quiet. "Why?" Naomi said. "Are you telling me this?" It was the right question, and she could see that he respected it, which was a small thing, but she noted it. "Because I've been in this organization for 9 years," he said, "and I know the difference between a person who builds something and a person who tears something down to build their monument on the rubble." He looked at the document in her hands. "Victoria is the second kind. I believed for a long time that her ambitions were contained, that she wanted influence but understood limits." He stopped. "I was wrong about that. What does she plan to do with the transfer?" "The money is already in the shells. It's been moved once since the initial transfer, parceled into smaller accounts across 4 jurisdictions. If the transfer authorization is discovered and investigated, the forensic trail leads to you. The shell structure was designed to look like personal enrichment, the amounts, the timing, the account relationships." He shook his head. "It looks like you've been stealing from the families for 3 years." The thing that happened in Naomi's chest in that moment was not describable as any single emotion. It was the compound impact of multiple things arriving simultaneously. The recognition of the specific surgical cruelty of it, the understanding of how long it had been in preparation, the particular nausea of realizing that the thing she had built most carefully and most privately was the exact thing that had been chosen as the weapon. The fund, the families, the scholarships and the mortgages, and the widow in Phoenix with her paid-off house, weaponized against her. She kept her face still. "Does Damien know?" she said. "I don't believe so." Victoria was careful about timing. She intended this to surface after tonight, after the public campaign against your reputation had already done its work. A woman who was humiliated in public, whose behavior became erratic and defensive, who was clearly unstable under pressure. He spread his hands slightly. And then the financial records surface. It becomes a pattern. It becomes a story that confirms itself. Naomi set the document down on the desk beside her and looked at it for a moment. "She's been planning this for 4 years," she said. "Closer to 3, I think. But the foundation of it, yes." "And you've known for 4 days?" "Yes." "Why didn't you come to me 4 days ago?" The question landed and Webb had the decency to let it sit. "I wasn't sure," he said finally, "which side of this I was on." The honesty of it startled her. She hadn't expected honesty from him. She wasn't sure what she'd expected, but it wasn't that. "And now?" she said. "Now I'm standing here," he said. "That should tell you something." She picked up the document again and folded it precisely along its original creases. She looked at Marcus Webb and thought about 9 years of loyalty and 4 days of uncertainty and the decision he'd just made by walking through that door, and she thought about what it cost people to choose correctly, when choosing correctly was the harder and more dangerous option. "I need to know," she said, "where the accounts are. I have the information. And I need to know who else Victoria has in the organization." Webb's expression shifted slightly. She recognized that shift. It was the expression of a man about to deliver the thing he's been holding back, the real piece. "That," he said, "is the more complicated question. Tell me anyway." "It's not just the organization," he said. "Victoria has been cultivating relationships outside the syndicate, federal level. A prosecutor in the Southern District who has been building a RICO case against the Ashford operation for 2 years." He paused. "She's been feeding information. Selectively. Enough to build the case, but structured so that the primary target the case revolves around is Damien," Naomi said. "You," he said. The word hit like something physical. "She was going to hand you to the federal prosecution as the financial architect of the entire operation, not Damien. He's too insulated. The case against him would take another 5 years they don't have. But you, with the forged transfer documents, with the shell account trail, with the reputation damage from tonight establishing you as someone with motive and character issues, I become the face of the organization's crimes," Naomi said. Her voice was completely flat. "I become the story the prosecution tells the jury, and Damien survives, mourning, betrayed, the man who trusted the wrong person." Webb looked at her steadily. "Victoria becomes the woman who helped him through the crisis, who was there when it mattered, who had always been there. The architecture of it was so complete, so patient, so thoroughly built that Naomi could almost feel an involuntary admiration for the construction of it pressing against the absolute horror of standing inside it. She had been the target for 4 years, and she had spent 4 years protecting a family from conflict without knowing the conflict had already been declared, had already been funded, had already been aimed. She pressed her fingers against the inside of her wrist. Her pulse was fast but steady. She focused on the steadiness. "The prosecutor," she said. "What's the timeline?" Victoria was planning to hand over the transfer documents and the account information within the next 10 days, before Damien returns from overseas and before he has time to audit the fund independently. He paused. "If the documents reach the prosecution, the arrest warrant follows within 72 hours. The way the case is structured, I know how it works," she said. She did know. She had spent 4 years living inside an organization that operated at the intersection of power and law, and she had paid attention, and she understood exactly how quickly a narrative could become a legal reality once the right paperwork was filed with the right office. She had 10 days, maybe fewer if Victoria had decided to accelerate the timeline because of whatever was happening tonight. She put the document inside the small clutch she'd been carrying all evening and straightened up and looked at Marcus Webb and said, "Who else knows what you've just told me?" "No one. No one in the organization." "No one," he repeated. "You need to be certain of that." "I am." She looked at him for a long moment. She was calculating, not cynically, not coldly, but with the specific precision of a person who has been handed a narrow window and needs to understand its exact dimensions before deciding how to move through it. "I need 2 things from you," she said. "Name them." "I need you to go back into that ballroom and behave exactly as you have been behaving all evening. Talk to Victoria if she approaches you. Do not signal anything. Do not change your pattern." She paused. "And I need the account information. All of it. Every shell, every jurisdictional route, every transfer record you have access to." "I can get you the accounts tonight," he said. "I have a secure copy." "Get it to Gerald. He'll know how to hold it." She saw his expression. "Gerald is mine," she said, which was the most direct she had been with anyone all evening about the actual shape of her position in this household. "He has been for 3 years." Webb nodded slowly. Something in his face had shifted since walking into the room. Not relief exactly, but the specific settling of a person who has been carrying a decision on their own for 4 days and has finally transferred its weight to someone capable of bearing it. "Mrs. Ashford," he said, moving toward the door. He stopped with his hand on the frame and looked back. "For what it's worth something," she said. "Go." He went. She stood alone in the library for 30 seconds, not thinking, She had finished the immediate thinking, and the next phase required the ballroom, not the library, just breathing. Just being a person with a body and a pulse and a life that had just changed shape in a way that couldn't be changed back. She thought about Clara Reyes, who had looked at her across the table and asked if she was going to be okay, and who had not believed it when she said yes. She thought about the 17 families, the scholarship accounts, the widow in Phoenix, the things she'd built not because anyone was watching, but because they needed to be built. And she'd had the capacity to build them, and that had seemed like reason enough. She thought about Damien somewhere above them all. She didn't know yet that he was closer than that, didn't know about the service corridor, didn't know about the 11 minutes of watching. And she thought about the conversation they were going to have, which would be the hardest conversation of their marriage, because it would require her to tell him how much she had known and said nothing, and how much she had not known and been almost destroyed by. She picked up her clutch. She checked the document was secure. She straightened her dress over the champagne stain that had been there for 2 hours now, and which she had stopped thinking about and which had stopped mattering approximately 45 minutes ago. She opened the library door and walked back toward the ballroom, and her face, when she came through the corridor into the light, was the most composed it had been all evening. Not because she was calm, she was not calm. Underneath the composed face, her mind was moving at a speed that felt almost mechanical, processing and prioritizing and building the shape of what needed to happen in the next 10 days, the next 48 hours, the next 20 minutes. She was not the woman who had walked into this gala. That woman had been trying to survive the night without causing damage. This woman understood that the damage had already been done, was already in motion, had been in motion for 4 years, and that surviving it now required something she had spent her entire marriage carefully not being. She walked into the ballroom. Victoria saw her immediately. She had the instinct of a predator for the return of something she'd been tracking. And for one fraction of a second, something crossed her face that was almost confusion. Because the woman who had walked back into the room did not look like the woman she'd spent all evening engineering toward breaking. She looked like something else entirely, and Victoria, who was very good at reading rooms and people and the spaces between them, could not immediately name what she was looking at. She would name it later. She would name it the moment the ballroom doors opened and the room went silent, and she understood, with the completeness of total comprehension, that she had spent 4 years building a trap and had somehow, in the last 20 minutes, walked into it herself. But that was not yet. Right now, Naomi crossed the ballroom floor and returned to her seat and picked up her water glass and met Clara Reyes's eyes across the table and gave the smallest, most fractional nod. The kind of nod that means I'm still here and something has changed and stay close all at once, without containing any of those words. Clara held her gaze for 1 second. Then she picked up her own glass and looked away. Above them, in the service corridor that ran along the gallery's edge, Damien Ashford had his phone to his ear and was speaking in a voice so quiet it was barely sound at all, and the person he was speaking to was already moving, and the convoy of armored vehicles that had been sitting in the estate's private lot for the last 43 minutes was beginning, very quietly, to reposition. The night had stopped being about humiliation 20 minutes ago. It had become something else, something with the particular weight and velocity of a thing that has been building for 4 years and has finally found the specific configuration of circumstance required to. The thing that finally moved Damien Ashford out of the service corridor was not Victoria tearing the shawl from Naomi's shoulders. It was the sound Naomi didn't make. He had been standing in that gallery for 43 minutes. He had watched the tray. He had watched the table reassignment. He had watched the champagne and Harlan's speech and the laughter that followed each small destruction with the appetite of something that had been fed and wanted more. He had stood completely still through all of it, with his jaw locked and his breathing controlled because he had spent 30 years learning that the most dangerous thing a man in his position could do was move before he understood the full shape of what he was looking at. He understood the full shape now. Victoria stepped forward and took the embroidered shawl from Naomi's shoulders. Not pulled it off, not yanked it, but removed it with the deliberate leisure of someone making a point about ownership, and held it at arm's length and let it drop to the marble floor, and said, in a voice constructed to carry, "A woman like you will never deserve the Ashford name. You know that. This room knows that. The only person who hasn't accepted it yet is you." The room laughed. Not everyone, but enough. The particular laugh of people who have been waiting all evening for permission
and have finally received it, and are relieved to have it, and don't examine too closely what the relief says about them. Naomi stood in her champagne-stained gown with the shawl on the floor at her feet. And she did not cry. She did not reach for the shawl. She did not raise her voice. She looked at Victoria with an expression Damien couldn't fully read from the gallery. Not defeat, not rage, something older than both of those. And she said nothing. The nothing was the thing that moved him. Because he knew her. He had been married to her for 4 years, and he knew the specific quality of her silences, and the silence she was holding right now was not the silence of a woman who had nothing left. It was the silence of a woman who had made a decision and was holding it steady while the room spent itself on her, waiting for the moment she would need it. She was protecting something. She had been protecting something all night, in every room, through every insult, with every carefully maintained neutral expression. And it had taken him 43 minutes of watching to understand that what she was protecting was not her dignity, though she had maintained that with a discipline that made something in his chest ache with a feeling he didn't have a ready name for. But him. The organization. The relationships in this room that a public confrontation would fracture in ways that would take years to repair. She had known that. She had calculated it and made the choice and carried it alone, and the room had mistaken her restraint for weakness, so thoroughly that they had escalated all the way to this, to Victoria Hale standing in the center of the Ashford ballroom with his wife's shawl on the floor at her feet, performing a coronation that nobody had authorized. He put his phone in his pocket. He walked to the end of the service corridor and took the stairs down to the main level and pushed open the door that led to the private entrance at the east side of the ballroom, and he walked through it, and the 2 men he'd posted at the corridor entrance fell into step behind him without a word, and then 2 more at the ballroom threshold, and then he pushed the ballroom doors open and walked in. The sound died. Not immediately. It took about 3 seconds, the way these things travel, the silence spreading outward from the point of his entry like something dropped in still water. By the time it reached the far end of the room, 400 people had gone completely quiet, and the only sound was the last note of the string quartet, which the first violinist held 1 beat too long before stopping. Damien didn't look at the room. He looked at Naomi. She had turned when the doors opened along with everyone else, and when she saw him, the thing that crossed her face lasted less than a second and was gone, controlled with the speed of someone who has learned to manage their own expressions in public spaces. But he saw it. It was not relief. It was not surprise. It was the specific, complicated look of a person who has been holding something very heavy for a very long time and has just become aware that help has arrived, and is not yet certain whether to let themselves feel that. He crossed the ballroom floor. He walked directly to her, not around her, not at an angle, directly, a straight line from the doors to where she was standing, which meant walking past Victoria, who was still holding the position she'd been in when the doors opened, the shawl still on the floor, her face now performing the expression of someone who is rapidly calculating. He didn't look at Victoria. He reached Naomi and he took off his jacket, the dark jacket he'd traveled in, which had been on for 16 hours and smelled like airport air and stress and something that was just him, and he placed it around her shoulders. His hands rested there for 1 moment, on her shoulders, and she felt the weight of them and stood very still. He turned and looked at the room. "Who touched my wife?" he said. He did not raise his voice. He didn't need to. The acoustics of the Ashford ballroom were excellent, and the room was absolutely silent, and Damien Ashford's voice at its quietest had a particular quality that people who had been in rooms with him described afterward in almost identical terms, like something that was already decided. No one answered. He let the silence run for 8 full seconds, which in that room felt geological. Then he said, "Gerald." Gerald appeared from the edge of the room with the speed of a man who had been waiting to be useful all evening. "Sir, pull the footage from all interior cameras. The main floor, the east salon, the corridor cameras, all of it. I want it running on the presentation system in 10 minutes. Gerald said, "Yes, sir," and moved. Victoria found her voice somewhere in those 8 seconds. She stepped forward, and the fact that she stepped forward instead of back told Damien something about the depth of her commitment to the position she'd taken, which was that she was too far into it to retreat, which meant she had already decided that the only way out was through. "Damien," she said. Her voice had the warmth in it, the honey and gravel warmth that she deployed when she needed to reframe a situation quickly.
You're back early. We weren't expecting. I know you weren't, he said. The warmth in her voice didn't flicker. It was professionally maintained. It's been a wonderful evening. There were a few tensions, perhaps, the way there always are at these gatherings, but nothing that. Victoria. He looked at her for the first time since entering the room. The look lasted about 2 seconds. Stop talking. The warmth went out. Not gradually, instantly, the way a light goes out when you cut the power. What was underneath it was something that Damien recognized and had been choosing not to see for several years, which was the particular expression of someone who has been planning a very long time and has just understood that the plan has failed and is now deciding what the failure cost them. He turned back to the room. Sit down, he said, to no one specifically and to everyone. We'll be watching something together in a few minutes. People sat. The speed with which 400 powerful, wealthy, dangerous people found their seats at a single instruction from Damien Ashford was its own kind of information about the nature of power in that room. Naomi had not moved. She was still standing where he'd left her, his jacket around her shoulders, watching him with that expression he couldn't fully read. He stepped back to her. Are you hurt? He said quietly, below the room's hearing. No, she said. Naomi. I'm not hurt. A pause. Marcus Webb is in the room. He came to me tonight with something you need to know about. There's a document in my bag. Another pause. It's bad, Damien. The financial kind of bad. He looked at her. His face didn't change expression in any way that the room could observe, but she had been watching his face for 4 years, and she saw the slight tightening around his eyes that meant he had just recategorized the evening from a social problem into an operational one. How bad, he said. 47 million, forged authorization, my signature, federal involvement. She held his gaze. She's been building it for 4 years. Tonight was the cover. 3 seconds of complete stillness. Okay, he said, just that. Then, stay close to me. She almost said something about not needing to be managed. She stopped herself because this was not the moment for that conversation, and she knew the difference between being managed and being protected by someone who had just understood the scope of what she'd walked into alone. Okay, she said. Gerald had the presentation system running in 9 minutes, not 10. The main screen above the bar, normally used for the syndicate's annual performance presentations, a deeply ironic application of the technology in the current context, lit up with the first camera feed. The room watched itself. Naomi had known it was coming and still felt something visceral move through her when she saw the footage of the ballroom from above. The fisheye perspective of the ceiling camera that had caught the champagne incident with a clarity that removed every possible interpretation except the one that had actually happened. She heard someone near the front of the room inhale sharply. She heard, 3 tables away, the particular quality of silence that means someone recognizes themselves in what they're watching. Damien stood at the edge of the screen with his arms at his sides and watched without commentary. The footage ran for 11 minutes. The tray scene. The East Salon. The interior camera had caught Harlan's voice clearly through the partially open door. The audio muffled, but the words recoverable. The moment at the table. The shawl. When it ended, the room was the quietest it had been all night. Damien turned to look at his uncle. Harlan Ashford was seated at the main family table, his large hands folded on the tablecloth, his face the color of old paper. He had the posture of a man who understands that the structural position of the building he's been sitting in has just changed and is trying to determine whether it's about to fall. Harlan, Damien said, you called my wife into the salon. I was... Harlan stopped. Started again. The family's reputation. You called my wife into a private room, Damien said in the same even, carried voice, and suggested she was a liability. While Victoria ran this room, he looked at his uncle for a long moment. That wasn't independent judgment, Harlan. You don't have that kind of initiative on your own anymore. That was someone else's play, run through you. He paused. How long have you been running Victoria's errands? The silence was different now. Not the silence of an audience watching a spectacle. The silence of a room understanding that lines were being drawn with permanent ink. I want a word, Harlan said. In private. No, Damien said. We're done having things in private. This room, tonight, has demonstrated exactly what happens when things happen in private. He looked at the empty screen above the bar. Everything from here happens in front of witnesses. Victoria moved. She had been standing immobile for the 11 minutes of the footage, and now she moved, not toward the door, not away from Damien, but forward, and the forward movement had the quality of a decision being executed rather than a reaction being made. And Naomi recognized that quality because she had been making exactly that kind of decision all evening. "Damien," Victoria said. Her voice was different now. The warmth was gone. The calculation was gone. And what was left was something rawer and more honest than anything Naomi had heard from her all evening. "Before you do whatever you've decided to do, let me say one thing." Damien waited. "Everything I've worked toward," she said, "every year I spent in this organization, every relationship I built, every decision I supported, I did it because I believed in what this family could be, what it should be." Her voice didn't waver. Naomi noted that, involuntarily, the steadiness of it. "And then you brought her in, and I watched everything I'd spent 15 years building get handed to someone who didn't understand what it cost." "I understand what things cost," Naomi said. She hadn't planned to speak. It came out anyway. Not loud, not heated, but with the weight of 3 years of anonymous charity work, and 17 families and 1 widow in Phoenix, and the specific, inexpressible cost of spending 4 years being treated like a mistake, and choosing every single day not to answer it with the kind of response it deserved. Victoria looked at her. For the first time all evening, she looked at her directly, without performance, without the weapon smile or the calculated warmth or the architecture of her campaign. She just looked. "You don't know what you took from me," she said. "No," Naomi said. "I know what you took from other people." She opened her clutch and removed the folded document and held it out, not to Victoria but to Damien. He took it. He unfolded it. He read the first page with the stillness of a man who has learned to receive catastrophic information without visibly receiving it, and then he looked up at Marcus Webb, who was standing at the edge of the room with his hands clasped in front of him and the expression of a man who has made his choice and is prepared to live with its consequences. "Marcus," Damien said. "Sir." "Is this complete?" "What she has." "There's more. I have the full account structure, the transfer routes, and the contact information for the Southern District contact." He paused. "I gave the account documentation to Gerald 2 hours ago." Damien looked at Gerald, who nodded once. Victoria's composure, the last architecture of it, the final wall, broke. Not in the way Naomi had expected, not in a collapse. It broke in a forward direction, in the only direction she seemed to know how to move. "You think," she said, and her voice was shaking now, the first time all evening it had shaken. "You think handing that document to him changes anything? The accounts are already positioned. The contacts in the Southern District have already received the initial documentation package. The process is already what?" Damien said. She stopped. "Already started?" he said. "Is that what you were going to say?" The room had stopped breathing. Not metaphorically. Naomi could feel it. The collective suspension of 400 people who understood that what was happening in front of them had moved past theater and into the territory of something real and consequential and not fully reversible. "Because if the process is already started," Damien said, and his voice had changed now. Not louder, but different, the way water changes when it goes from moving to very fast. "Then you've committed to a position you can't walk back from. And that means this conversation is going to go a different direction than I would have preferred." Victoria looked at him. Then she looked at Naomi. Then she looked at the room, at the 400 people who had laughed with her, taken her signals, followed her direction all evening, who were now sitting in their chairs watching her with the specific expression of people recalculating where their loyalty had actually resided and finding the answer inconvenient. "You were all just here," she said to the room. "You all saw what I saw for the last 4 years. You all said the same things I said. You—" She stopped. Don't sit there and perform surprise. You knew. Every single person at these tables knew that this marriage was enough. Damien's voice was quiet and absolute. Victoria's mouth closed. "The Callahan representatives," Damien said, looking toward the Chicago table. "I'd like you to remain after the evening concludes. We'll need to discuss operational continuity for the northern accounts." He looked toward Evelyn Marsh. Evelyn, similarly. He looked at the Fontaine cluster. The southern operations will require restructuring in the next 30 days. We'll talk. He looked back at the room. For everyone else, I appreciate your attendance tonight. I appreciate your patience with what has been an unusual evening, and I want to be clear about something. He paused, and the pause had the weight of a man choosing words with the specific care of someone who understands they'll be repeated in every room in the American underworld before the week is out. This organization was built on one principle: not violence, not money, not fear. He looked at Naomi. Loyalty. The real kind. The kind that costs something and keeps going anyway. He looked back at the room. Tonight I watched my wife demonstrate more loyalty to this family than every person who laughed at her expense combined. I want that on record. I want every person in this room to carry it out with them when they leave. He picked up his glass from the nearest table. The next question is what we do about the people who didn't. Victoria took a step toward the door. One of the men in black who had followed Damien in from the private entrance was already there. She stopped. The room watched her stop. She turned back and her face had arrived somewhere Naomi hadn't seen it all evening. Past the strategy, past the campaign, past the warmth and the weapon smile, and the 4 years of careful construction. She looked exhausted. She looked like a woman who has spent everything and arrived at the end of the spending and is discovering, with the particular shock of it, that there is nothing on the other side. I want a lawyer, she said. That's reasonable, Damien said. You'll have access to one. He nodded at the man by the door. Take her to the East Salon. Keep it private. He looked at Victoria one more time. You'll be comfortable. That's more than you arranged for my wife tonight. Victoria walked toward the East Salon with her spine straight and her hands at her sides. And Naomi watched her go and felt something that was not satisfaction. She had expected to feel satisfaction and found instead something more complicated, something closer to the particular sadness of watching a person arrive at the inevitable consequence of a thing they had chosen. A sadness that had nothing to do with forgiveness and everything to do with the waste of it, all that intelligence and patience and capacity, all those years, all that construction, directed at destruction. She watched the door close. She became aware that Damien was beside her. The document, he said quietly. The forgery. How long have you known? 2 hours, she said. Webb came to me in the library. And before that? She looked at him. I knew she was running something. I didn't know the shape of it. A pause. I should have pushed harder to find out. I chose not to because I was trying to not cause conflict, he said. Yes. He was quiet for a moment. Around them the room was beginning its careful reorganization. The Callahans conferring, Evelyn Marsh on her phone, the Fontaines moving toward the bar with the specific purposefulness of people who need a drink before a difficult conversation. The machinery of the organization recalibrating, the way it did, because this was what organizations like this one did. They survived their crises by immediately beginning to process the aftermath of them. I owe you a conversation, Damien said. You owe me several, she said. He looked at her, really looked, the way he had in the gallery, the full attention of him focused on her face, and she held it, and neither of them looked away. The fund, he said. The families. The accounts Webb brought you. He paused. How long have you been running that? 3 years, she said. I used the discretionary account. I kept records. She paused. I was going to tell you. When? She almost said when it felt safe, and stopped herself because it was too honest and too indicting and also completely true, and she was tired of not saying the things that were completely true. When it felt safe, she said. His jaw moved. Not in anger, in the particular way that people's faces move when they receive information that reorganizes their understanding of something, when the recalibration is happening in real time and the face can't fully conceal the process. 47 families, he said. It wasn't a question. He'd read the document. 47, yes. And the scholarship accounts. 11 currently active. He was quiet. I was trying, she said, and her voice cracked on the word. Not broke, not collapsed, just cracked, the way things do when they've been held under pressure for a long time, and the pressure finally gets to choose where the release happens. I was trying to make the name mean something, not the power of it, not the fear of it, something that could, I don't know, something that could justify the rest of it. He put his hand on the back of her neck, gently, The way you hold something fragile that is not actually fragile, but that you want to hold carefully anyway. She breathed. We have a federal contact problem, he said. I know. And about 40 minutes before the people in this room start making calls that complicate the next 30 days. I know. So we're going to have to. I know, Damien. She looked up at him. I know what we have to do. I've been thinking about it since the library. He looked at her for one more second. Then something in his face changed. Not softened, that wasn't the right word for it, but opened slightly, the way a door opens that has been closed a long time, and the hinges are stiff, but the door does open, and the opening is real. Tell me, he said. She told him. And above them the Ashford ballroom sat in its particular altered silence, 400 people in the process of understanding that they had attended something tonight that they would not forget. That the woman they had watched carry a serving tray and endure a shawl being dropped at her feet was now standing in the center of the room in her champagne-stained dress with her husband's jacket on her shoulders, speaking in a low, urgent, completely focused voice, while Damien Ashford listened with the full attention of a man who has just discovered that the person he married had been more than he understood. And the discovery was doing something to his face that the people who had known him for 30 years in this world had never quite. Part 5. Hồi kẹt của kịch bản điện ảnh này được triển khai với dung lượng 500 từ. Bắt đầu trực tiếp từ điểm kết thúc của Part 4, yêu cầu bắt đầu bằng việc giải quyết triệt để đỉnh điểm cao trào từ phần trước. Cuộc đối đầu cuối cùng phải diễn ra khốc liệt và chân thực, nơi mỗi cái giá phải trả đều trở nên đắt đỏ và không có chiến thắng nào là dễ dàng. Hãy đảm bảo mỗi nút thắt, bí mật và mâu thuẫn từ Part 1 được phơi bày và xử lý trọn vẹn, standalone ending, không để lại bất kỳ chi tiết thủa hay mở ra phần tiếp theo. Duy trì giọng văn mỹ thô ráp nhưng sâu lắng, tập trung vào sự biến đổi nội tâm của nhân vật sau cơn bão. Hội thoại trong phần này cần mang sức nặng của sự trao đổi, cay đắng và chân thực, lồng ghép tinh tế những thông điệp về bản chất con người và ý chí sinh tồn thông qua hành động thay vì triết lý suông. Hãy kể theo ngôi thứ 3, triển khai chi tiết từng phân cảnh, scene by scene, với nhịp điệu chậm dần về cuối để tạo sự lắng động, tuyệt đối không sử dụng gạch đầu dòng, tiêu đề phụ hay nhắc đến thực thể tôn giáo. Hãy trình bày trực tiếp trong tin nhắn, viết cực kỳ chi tiết từng ánh mắt, cử chỉ và hơi thở cuối cùng của câu chuyện. Nếu đặt giới hạn phản hồi, hãy dừng lại ở một câu rạng rỡ để tôi ra lệnh viết tiếp nhằm đảm bảo độ sâu sắc nhất cho kịch bản lồng tiếng 2 tiếng. Chỉ đơn bắt buộc. Đây là một câu chuyện điện ảnh hoàn toàn hư cấu nhằm mục đích giải trí, không dựa trên bất kỳ sự kiện hay nhân vật có thật nào. Lưu ý đặc biệt quan trọng. Nếu đạt đến giới hạn trả lời, không được rung giữa câu hay viết nốt câu đó hoàn chỉnh không mở rộng nội dung. Show more scene on him before, which was the expression of a man being surprised by someone he thought he already knew completely, and finding that the surprise was not an indictment, but a gift, and not knowing yet what to do with a gift of that particular size. The next 4 hours were the most expensive hours of Damien Ashford's professional life, and he spent them working. He spent them on the phone, at the desk in the private study off the East Corridor, with Naomi sitting across from him, and the full account documentation Marcus Webb had given Gerald spread between them. He made 11 calls. She made 3. Between calls, she organized the documents into a sequence that built the clearest possible forensic picture of what Victoria had constructed: the forged authorization, the shell account architecture, the transfer routing, and the federal contact chain that Webb had mapped over 4 days of quiet, careful investigation. She did this not because she was asked to, but because it needed to be done, and she could do it, and sitting still would have been impossible. Damien watched her work between his calls and said nothing about it, which was its own kind of acknowledgement. The first call was to the syndicate's primary legal counsel, a man named Rothstein, who had been practicing the specific, complicated law of organizations like the Ashford Syndicate for 35 years, and who received catastrophic information with the professional calm of someone who had been receiving catastrophic information for 35 years and had simply decided not to let it touch his blood pressure. How solid is the forgery evidence? Rothstein asked. Forensic examination will confirm it, Damien said. We have the original authorization documents for comparison. The signature reproduction is good, but the pen pressure is inconsistent on the third letter. Who noticed that? Damien looked at Naomi, who was highlighting a transfer routing number without looking up. My wife, he said. A pause on the line. Good eyes, Rothstein said. Yes,
Damien said. They are.
The second call was to a man whose name Naomi didn't know and didn't ask for, who spoke for about 90 seconds, and then the call ended. After it, Damien sat for a moment with his hand resting on the phone. The Southern District contact, he said. Webb's information was accurate? More than accurate. He looked at the wall for a moment. She'd been feeding them for 14 months. Not randomly, selectively. Enough to build a case structure that would hold up, but structured so that every piece pointed at one target. Me. You. He looked at her. The prosecutor who received her information has been operating under the belief that he's closing in on the financial architect of a criminal organization. What he's actually closing in on is a fabrication so well constructed that it would have taken months, probably, to untangle. He paused. If it had ever been examined at all. She understood what he wasn't saying, which was, if tonight had gone the way Victoria planned it, if the public humiliation had done its work, if Naomi's reputation had been sufficiently damaged before the document surfaced, the prosecution might have moved quickly enough that the examination never happened. A swift arrest, a compelling narrative, a plea deal that resolved things before forensic analysis could intervene. She was going to let me take a prison sentence, Naomi said. Yes. She had understood this in the library when Webb first explained it. She understood it again now, hearing Damien say it, and found that understanding something twice could feel completely different both times. The first time, it had been a piece of information to be processed and acted on. The second time, sitting in the study with the evidence spread between them, it arrived as something more personal, as the full weight of what 4 years of quiet endurance had almost cost her. She set down the highlighter. She pressed her hands flat on the table. Okay, she said. Damien watched her. Okay, she said again, and picked the highlighter back up. The third call was to a woman named Diane Chen, who ran a forensic accounting practice in Lower Manhattan and who owed Damien a favor she had been hoping he would forget. He had not forgotten. She agreed to have a team examining the transfer documentation within 6 hours. By 2 in the morning, the ballroom had emptied. The Callahans had stayed until midnight, the conversation with Damien conducted with the careful formality of men reassessing the stability of a structure they'd built adjacent to and deciding it was still sound. Evelyn Marsh had stayed later. She and Naomi had spoken briefly, alone, while Damien was on his third call, a conversation that lasted 7 minutes, in which Evelyn ended by putting her hand briefly on Naomi's arm and saying nothing at all, which communicated more than most people manage with full sentences. The Fontaines had left early, which told Damien something he filed away for later. Gerald supervised the breakdown of the event with the contained efficiency of a man who had been waiting all evening to do something useful and was now doing it with considerable feeling. He caught Naomi's eye once, across the emptying ballroom, and gave her a look that she understood to mean, I've been here the whole time. I always was. She nodded once, and he looked away and went back to directing the staff. Victoria had been in the East Salon for 6 hours before Rothstein arrived with a colleague and a document. Damien went to the salon at 2:15 in the morning. Naomi went with him. Victoria was seated in the leather chair by the window, the same window Harlan had stood at when he summoned Naomi earlier in the evening, which now felt like something that had happened in a different geological era. She looked up when they entered, and her face had the particular quality of a person who has been alone with their own thoughts for 6 hours and has arrived somewhere on the other side of them. Not peace. Naomi didn't think Victoria was capable of peace in the traditional sense. Not now, maybe not ever. But a kind of settled clarity. The face of someone who has fully accepted the territory they're standing in. Rothstein sat across from her. His colleague set a recorder on the table between them. You understand, Rothstein said, that we're not law enforcement. This conversation will be used for civil and organizational purposes. Your criminal exposure is a separate matter that will be handled through appropriate channels. He paused. You have the right to have your own attorney present before you say anything. I know my rights, Victoria said. Do you want your attorney? She looked at Damien, not at Rothstein. At Damien, directly, with the same honesty she'd shown in the ballroom in the last moments before the East Salon door closed behind her. I want to tell you something, she said to him. Tell me, he said. Not for the record. She glanced at the recorder. Everything in this room is on the record, Damien said. She looked at him for a long moment. Then she looked at the recorder, and then she looked at her hands, and then she looked at Naomi. I didn't hate you, she said. The words came out with the flat certainty of something true that had cost something to say. I want you to know that. I know it doesn't change anything. Naomi stood at the edge of the room with Damien's jacket still on her shoulders and said nothing. I hated what you represented, Victoria said. What it meant that he chose you. Not because of any of the things I said tonight. Those were weapons. I know that. She paused. Because he chose someone who could love this thing without needing it, without needing the power of it. And I had needed it for so long that I couldn't look at you without seeing everything I'd sacrificed to get here and what it had made of me. The room was quiet. I'm not asking for anything, Victoria said. I'm not asking for your understanding. I'm telling you what was true because I've been sitting here for 6 hours and I'm tired of things that aren't said. Naomi looked at her for a long time. I know what you did to the families, she said finally. The ones the fund was built for. The ones your fraud would have stripped of the money they were depending on if Webb hadn't found it in time. She paused. I can understand a lot of things, Victoria. I have a very high capacity for understanding things. But those families, the widow in Phoenix, the children in those scholarship accounts, they are not abstractions to me. They are the work, and you use the work to destroy me. Victoria looked at her hands. That, Naomi said, I cannot find my way to understanding. Victoria nodded once, slowly, as though she'd expected this answer and had been preparing to receive it. Okay, she said. Then to Rothstein, get your colleague to start the recorder again. Let's do this. The formal statement took 2 hours. Damien and Naomi left after the first 40 minutes, once the core confirmation of the forgery, the federal contact's identity, and the shell account structure had been established on record. Rothstein would handle the rest. He was paid very well to handle the rest. In the corridor outside the salon, Damien leaned against the wall and exhaled, which was the most openly exhausted Naomi had ever seen him, and she had seen him in some difficult moments. The federal contact, she said. Rothstein's colleague is handling it. The prosecutor's superior owes a significant favor. It'll be managed. Managed meaning. Meaning the case file gets examined by eyes with the appropriate context. Meaning the forensic evidence gets where it needs to go. Meaning it doesn't move any further. He looked at the ceiling. It won't be clean. Nothing about the next 6 months will be clean. But it's contained. It will be. He looked at her. What? Because of Webb. Because of Webb, she agreed. He's going to need to be repositioned. He can't stay in the financial operations. Too much exposure now. Too many people who know he flipped on Victoria. I know. She thought for a moment. The Legacy Foundation is going to need a financial director. Someone who actually understands the account structures and can build them properly. Openly. She paused. He'd be good at it, and it would protect him. Damien looked at her. What? She said. Nothing, he said. I'm just watching you work. I've been working all night. I know, he said. I know you have. The silence between them had a different quality than it had ever had before. Not the comfortable silence of a marriage that had learned to live around its unsaid things, but a rawer silence, the kind that comes after something has been opened that was closed for a long time, and the air on both sides is still adjusting. I need to say something, Damien said. She waited. The salon. When Harlan called you in, he pushed off the wall and stood straight. I watched the footage. I heard what he said. And I know that conversation didn't happen because Harlan woke up this morning and decided to run Victoria's agenda. It happened because the conditions in this family allowed it to happen, for 4 years. He paused. I allowed it. Damien, let me finish. His voice was quiet, but it had the quality of a man who has been composing something for several hours and needs to deliver it completely. I knew this room was hard for you. I knew the family had resistance. I told myself you were strong enough to handle it, which was true, and I told myself you preferred to handle it your way, which was also true, and I used both of those true things to avoid having a harder conversation about what I should have been doing differently. He looked at her directly. That's not a small thing. I want you to know that I know it's not a small thing. She looked at him for a long moment. It's not a small thing, she agreed. No. But it's also not the only thing. She crossed her arms, not defensively. It was a cold corridor at 3 in the morning, and she was wearing a champagne-stained gown. and thought about how to say what she needed to say honestly without softening it into something that wasn't the truth. I could have pushed harder. I made choices too. I chose quiet over direct, every time, because I thought I was protecting something. She paused. Some of the time I was. Some of the time I was just afraid of being the problem, of confirming what they already believed I was. He was quiet. So, she said, we both have things we did that made tonight possible, and we can have the whole conversation about that, the real one, with all the parts in it, but not in a hallway at 3 in the morning after the night we've had. No, he agreed. Not now. Soon. Yes, he said. Soon. He looked at her. But I want to say, the fund, the families, what you built. He stopped, and she could see him looking for the right words, which was unusual for Damien, who was almost never at a loss for words. I'm glad you did it. I'm glad it exists. And I'm sorry it had to exist without me knowing, because that's a failure I own. She breathed. Thank you for saying that, she said. I mean it. I know you mean it. That's why I'm thanking you. He almost smiled. It wasn't quite a smile. It was the shadow of one, the shape a smile leaves behind. But she recognized it and felt something in her chest release that had been held tight for a very long time. Harlan was in the main study when they came back through. He was seated at the large desk, not behind it, which would have been an assertion of authority he no longer had the standing for, but beside it, in one of the visitor chairs, which was its own kind of statement about the recalibration that had happened in the last 6 hours. He was holding a glass of something amber that he hadn't drunk much of. He looked at Naomi when she entered, and he looked at her with the expression of a man who has spent 6 hours alone with himself and has arrived at something that cost him something to arrive at. I owe you an apology, he said. His voice was different than it had been in the salon. The 61 years of authority were still there, embedded in the timbre of it, but something had come out of it. The performance of the authority, the deliberate weight he usually put behind it. She looked at him. I was used, he said, by someone I should have seen more clearly. That's on me. He paused. But I also held views that made it easy for her to use me. And those are views I've had for a long time, and I'm not young enough to pretend they'll change completely. He looked at the glass in his hand. But I can tell you that I was wrong tonight, about what I said in that salon, about what I allowed in that ballroom. He looked at her again. I was wrong. Naomi stood in the doorway of the study with Damien behind her, and she looked at Harlan Ashford, 72 years old, large and diminished all at once, holding a glass he hadn't drunk, and she thought about what the right response to this moment was. Not the strategic response, not the organizational response, the human one. I know, she said, and I hear you. She didn't say she forgave him. She didn't say it was fine. She didn't perform a generosity she wasn't prepared to fully feel yet, because that had never been her way, and tonight of all nights was not the night to start performing things. But she heard him, and she let him know she heard him, and that was what the moment required and what she could honestly give it. Harlan nodded. He set the glass down. He stood, slowly, with the careful movements of a large man who has aged into his knees. And he walked out of the study, and as he passed Naomi in the doorway, he paused for just a moment and then kept moving. And she watched him go down the corridor toward the guest wing, and she thought, some things change all the way. Some things change enough. And some things just stop. She wasn't sure at which category Harlan fell into. She was willing to let time tell her. The sun came up on the Ashford estate at 6:14 in the morning. Naomi was in the kitchen when it did, not because she'd been awake all night, though she had been, but because kitchens at dawn are their own kind of honest space where the light comes in clean and flat and makes everything look like what it actually is. And after a night of things being other than what they actually were, she had needed that. She was making coffee. Not because she was particularly good at making coffee. Damien had better technique and the house had staff who had it down to a science. But because she wanted to do a simple thing with her hands. Something that required her body and not her mind. Something that had a clear beginning and a clear end. The coffee maker gurgled. The light through the east window went from gray to gold. She heard the door and turned. Clara Reyes was standing at the kitchen doorway, wearing a borrowed sweater that was too large for her, holding her shoes in one hand. I didn't realize anyone else was still here, Naomi said. Gerald said it was fine to stay. Clara looked at the coffee maker. Is that? There's enough, Naomi said. Clara came in and sat at the kitchen island and set her shoes on the floor beside the stool, and they waited for the coffee in silence, which was the comfortable kind. The kind between people who have been through something together, even if they went through it from different positions. Naomi poured 2 cups. She slid one across to Clara. How are you? Clara asked. Tired, Naomi said. Genuinely tired. That's the most honest thing I've heard anyone say since about 9 o'clock last night. Everything before that was theater. Everything before that, Clara agreed, was theater. She wrapped both hands around her cup. My father would have... She stopped. He used to say that the measure of an organization is what happens to the people who can't protect themselves. Whether someone takes care of them or whether they get forgotten. She looked at her coffee. He believed the Ashford organization was one of the ones that took care of people, mostly because of things he'd heard, things people told him, about arrangements that were made quietly for families who needed help. She looked up at Naomi. He never knew who made them. He spent 3 years wondering. Naomi said nothing. I figured it out tonight, Clara said. When you told me you knew who he was, the way you said it, I figured it out. The kitchen was quiet except for the sound of the house settling around them. He was a good man, Naomi said. I didn't know him well, but I knew enough. He was, Clara said. He was a good man in a complicated life. That sounds like a small thing to say about someone, but I've decided it's actually the hardest thing to be. She picked up her cup. Thank you, for what you did for my mother, for what you built. Don't thank me yet, Naomi said. The next 6 months are going to be complicated. I know. The fund will need to be restructured, opened up, made fully transparent, which it should have been from the beginning. There will be scrutiny, some of it federal, some of it from within the organization. I know, Clara said. I work in nonprofit governance, have for 6 years. She looked at Naomi steadily. I'm not suggesting anything. I'm just noting it. Naomi looked at her. Clara Reyes, who had her father's direct eyes and her own particular capacity for sitting in a room without performing anything, who had looked at Victoria Hale's social performance and reflected it back at the exact temperature it deserved, who had asked Naomi 3 times during the evening if she was okay and had been the only person in that room to ask even once. I'll be in touch, Naomi said. Clara nodded once and drank her coffee. Damien came into the kitchen at 6:40. He had changed out of his travel clothes into something simpler, dark pants, a plain shirt, the comfortable clothing of a man who had stopped performing for the night. He looked at Clara with the brief acknowledging expression he used for people he'd assessed and found present. Miss Reyes, he said. Mr. Ashford. Clara stood and picked up her shoes. I was just leaving. She looked at Naomi. You have my number. I have your number, Naomi said. Clara walked out, and a few moments later they heard the front door, and then her car, and then the sound of tires on gravel going quiet. Damien poured himself coffee and stood at the island across from where Naomi was sitting, and they looked at each other in the morning light, which was the cleanest light there is, and there was nothing left between them that was performing anything. Rothstein called, he said. The federal contact situation will be resolved by end of day. It won't be clean. There will be a negotiation. But the case against you is effectively over before it started. The accounts? Diane Chen's team is already working. By the time anyone looks at the transfer documentation officially, the forensic record will be unambiguous. And Victoria? He was quiet for a moment. Federal exposure on the fraud charges is real. The information she fed the prosecution means she's also looking at obstruction. Rothstein thinks she'll cooperate fully in exchange for reduced circumstances, controlled circumstances. He paused. She won't be in this world again, but she won't be invisible. Naomi thought about Victoria in the East Salon, sitting straight in the leather chair, talking for 2 hours into a recorder about 4 years of construction, about the careful architecture of a plan that had almost worked. She was smart, Naomi said. Yes. She could have built something real. Yes, he said. She could have. They both sat with that for a moment, with the waste of it, The specific sadness of intelligence and capability turned entirely toward destruction because the thing it most wanted had been taken out of reach. What happens to the families? Naomi said. The fund. During restructuring, there'll be a gap. There won't be a gap. He looked at her steadily. I spoke to Rothstein about formalizing the fund under the Ashford organization's charitable arm. Fully disclosed, fully funded, fully protected. He paused. I should have built this 4 years ago. I didn't. We're building it now. She looked at her coffee cup. The scholarship accounts, she said. All 11, continuing uninterrupted. He paused. There are 4 more applications pending that came through the anonymous intake process. I'd like to approve them. She looked up. If that's the right number, he said. Those 4... She stopped. You read the full file. Webb left it with Gerald. Gerald gave it to me an hour ago. He looked at her. Naomi, you interviewed those families. You reviewed the applications personally. You built the intake process from scratch, in 3 years, quietly, while attending events like last night and managing everything I didn't have the time or the understanding to manage. He set his cup down. I read the full file. She didn't know what was in her face right now. She was too tired to manage it and had decided somewhere around 4 in the morning to stop trying. Approve the 4, she said. Done, he said. And the board of the formal foundation. I'd like you to chair it. I'm your wife. You're the architect of the thing, he said. Chair it. She breathed. Okay, she said. The morning light moved across the kitchen floor, slow and even, the way light moves when it has no reason to hurry. Outside, the grounds of the Ashford estate were beginning their ordinary morning. Birds, distant traffic, the sound of the groundskeeping staff arriving. The world outside was doing what worlds do, which is continue, because worlds don't care about the individual evenings inside them, however consequential those evenings were to the people living through them. I want to ask you something, Naomi said. Ask. Last night, the gallery. She looked at him. How long were you watching before you came down? He considered whether to answer precisely. She could see him considering it. 43 minutes, he said. She received this. That's a long time, she said. Yes. You watched for 43 minutes. Yes. While they made me carry a tray. He looked at her directly and didn't flinch from it, which she appreciated. He could have explained himself, could have talked about information gathering, about understanding the full picture, about strategic patience. All of those things would have been true, and none of them would have been the real answer. Yes, he said. I did. She nodded once. We have a lot to talk about, she said. I know. Not today. No, not today. But soon. Yes, he said. Soon. All of it. She stood up and carried her cup to the sink and rinsed it, and turned back to look at him standing in the morning kitchen in his simple clothes with the tired eyes of a man who had been awake for more than 20 hours and who was still present, still in the room, still looking at her. There's something I need you to understand, she said. Tell me. I'm not going to be in this background anymore. She said it evenly, without heat, the way you say things that have been true for a while and are only now being said out loud. I will work with you on the foundation, and I'll be present in the rooms that need me, and I'll keep doing what I've been doing, but I'm not going to manage my own visibility to accommodate people who don't want me there, not anymore. I know, he said. I need you to know it in a way that includes acting on it, not just agreeing with it. I know, he said again, and this time the word had more in it, more weight, more specificity, the sound of a man who is not agreeing in principle, but committing to something in practice. She looked at him for a moment longer. Okay, she said. She walked out of the kitchen toward the main stairs, and he watched her go. And she felt him watching, and did not look back. Not because she was making a point, but because she was simply going upstairs to change out of a champagne-stained dress she had been wearing for 14 hours. And the most important things had already been said, and the rest was just the long, complicated, honest work of living in the aftermath of a night like this one. At the top of the stairs, she stopped. She put her hand on the banister and stood there for a moment looking at the entrance hall below. The marble floor, the high ceiling, the chandelier that had been lit for the gala, and was still lit now in the morning light, an extravagance no one had gotten around to switching off. She thought about the women in the rooms she'd been in last night, the ones who had laughed, the ones who had looked away, the one who had handed her a serving tray. She thought about what it cost a person to treat another person as less than they were, and whether those people ever understood what they were paying for it, whether the currency of their cruelty was ever fully visible to them as it left their hands. She thought about Victoria, who had been smart enough to build something extraordinary and had aimed it at the wrong thing. She thought about Clara, who had her father's eyes and 6 years in nonprofit governance and a borrowed sweater that was too big for her. She thought about Gerald, who had delivered insulting messages all evening with the face of a man ashamed of his errand, and who had been hers for 3 years, quiet and steady, because he had seen what she was building and decided that was worth his loyalty more than anything else in the building. She thought about the 47 families, the 11 scholarships, the widow in Phoenix in her paid-off house. She thought, that is what I have built, in 4 years, quietly, without anyone watching. Then she thought, imagine what I can build when people are watching. The chandelier in the entrance hall was still lit, and the morning light came in through the tall east windows and moved across the marble floor in long, clean angles. And the house was quiet around her, and she was still standing at the top of the stairs with her hand on the banister when Damien came out of the kitchen below and looked up and found her there. He didn't say anything. She didn't say anything. They looked at each other in the morning light, across the distance of a staircase in 4 years and one very long night, and the looking held everything that wasn't ready yet to be words. The unfinished conversations, the things that would need to be built and rebuilt, the distance between who they had been to each other and who they were going to have to learn to be. All of it was still there. None of it was going to be easy. She turned and walked down the hall toward their room, and behind her she heard him begin to climb the stairs. And she did not slow down, and he did not hurry. And they moved through the quiet house in the growing morning light, at their own pace, toward the same place, which was a beginning of something. Not a clean beginning, not a simple one, but the only kind that is ever real, the kind that comes after.